Long before the boundaries were drawn, before names were fixed upon maps, this land lay quiet beneath slow-moving skies, shaped only by ice, water, and time. The traces of those ancient forces remained visible still, even as human industry began to settle upon them. It was here, upon these low plains beside the inland seas, that a county took form whose story unfolded not in sudden drama, but in steady accumulation. Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to the year 1882 and come to rest in the southeastern extremity of the state of Michigan. Here, where the blue waters of the inland seas narrowed into a vital strait of passage, and where forest and field met the rising machinery of the age, lay the flat, fertile, and populous district known as Wayne County. In the census era of that decade, Wayne County stood as the commercial and demographic center of the peninsular state. Official federal returns taken shortly before this account recorded a population exceeding 160,000 inhabitants, already marking the county as exceptional in scale and activity. By the time these pages were written, continued settlement and migration had carried that number still higher, distributing its people across more than 600 square miles of land that served as a principal gateway to the interior of the continent. The boundaries of the county followed both nature and surveyor's rule. To the north, its line adjoined the neighboring counties of Macomb and Oakland, crossing wide clay plains shaped by ancient lakes. To the east, it met the swift and enduring current of the Detroit River and the open reach of Lake St. Clair, waters that formed the international boundary with the Dominion of Canada. To the south lay Monroe County, its limestone lands long settled and cultivated, while to the west stretched the agricultural districts of Washtenaw. Throughout, the land rose only gradually from river to interior, a glaciated plain of low elevation and broad horizons. The surface of Wayne County presented a study in restraint rather than drama. It lay mostly level, once the bed of a prehistoric lake, its contours softened by time. Only the shallow valleys of its streams and the faint sandy ridges of former shorelines disturbed the horizontal sweep. Along the river in the northeastern districts, the land had once been marshy and low, but careful drainage had transformed those wetlands into fields of dark and productive soil. Farther west and north, the ground rose almost imperceptibly, reaching its highest points among the gentle moraines of the interior townships. The soils of the county reflected the varied hand of glacial deposition. In the central districts, where heavy timber once stood unbroken, the earth was a stiff clay demanding labor, but rewarding it with lasting fertility. Along the sandy ridges, lighter soils warmed quickly under the sun, supporting vegetables and root crops destined for nearby markets. In the river bottoms, especially along the Rouge and the Huron, deep alluvial deposits lay rich with vegetable mold, renewing themselves with each season's flow. Even the former marshlands of Grosse Pointe, once known as the Grand Marais, were steadily yielding to cultivation, becoming among the most productive garden tracts of the county. Water shaped both the land and the life upon it. Dominating all was the Detroit River, known simply as the Strait, a channel of clear blue water flowing steadily between Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie. Unlike inland streams, it knew no sudden floods or seasonal retreat, serving instead as a constant highway for commerce and travel. Inland, the River Rouge gathered waters from a wide sweep of central and northern townships before entering the main channel below the city, while the Huron River traced a winding course through the southwestern corner, valued both for its beauty and its mill sites. Scattered throughout the county were numerous creeks and lesser streams, their names preserving traces of earlier inhabitants and explorers. Among them flowed the Ecorse River near the village of the same name, along with Monguagon Creek in the southern limestone districts, Brownstown Creek, Silver Creek, and Tonquish Creek in the western uplands. Connors Creek passed quietly through eastern settlements, while Bloody Run carried a name drawn from older conflicts now faded into memory. Together with the branches of the Rouge and smaller watercourses long since altered or covered, these streams wound through elm and hickory forests, watering pasture land and sustaining the dairies that supplied the growing population. Where the axe had not yet prevailed, dense hardwood forests still covered portions of the county. Wayne County's heavy timber was well known in regional markets, composed largely of oak in its several varieties: hickory, beech, maple, and elm. The black walnut, once plentiful, had become increasingly scarce, valued for fine furniture. The elm trees were especially notable, their tall, arching forms rising above the clay flats and lining roads and farmsteads alike. In the sandier districts, chestnut and whitewood appeared in scattered groves, while beneath the surface lay resources only beginning to be understood, including limestone near Trenton and deep beds of salt beneath the riverbanks. In such a landscape, shaped gently by water and time, the foundations were laid for both agriculture and industry. Fields, forests, and waterways together formed the quiet setting upon which the county's towns and families would build their lives, often unaware that the ordinary details of their surroundings would one day become the subject of careful record. Along the eastern margin of the county, where the land met the steady passage of the strait, lay the county seat and principal city, Detroit. Stretched for miles beside the river, it occupied a position long favored for trade and settlement, its streets and wharves shaped by centuries of movement upon the water. By this period, the city had grown into the acknowledged metropolis of the state, known widely for both its situation and its ordered plan. Its population numbered well above 100,000 souls, drawn from many origins yet bound together by labor and proximity. Descendants of the early French settlers lived alongside families from New England, while newer arrivals from Germany, Ireland, and Poland supplied much of the strength that powered the city's workshops and docks. Their languages and customs mingled quietly in markets, churches, and boarding houses, forming a civic character both industrious and restrained. The public buildings of the county seat reflected the confidence of the era. City Hall, rising at the Campus Martius, stood as the chief symbol of municipal authority, its sandstone walls and tall clock tower visible from many quarters. Nearby stood the Soldiers' Monument and the Opera House, anchoring the civic heart of the city. The federal presence appeared in the Custom House and Post Office on Griswold Street, while the Detroit Public Library occupied its triangular park on Gratiot Avenue, serving readers drawn from every class. The Wayne County Courthouse stood in classical dignity, joined by the House of Correction, the Marine Hospital, and the aging defenses of Fort Wayne along the river. The plan of the city followed a design unlike that of most American towns. From the riverfront, broad avenues extended outward in long rays. A legacy of early reconstruction after fire had cleared much of the settlement. Woodward Avenue formed the central axis, lined with prominent retail houses whose wide windows displayed goods from distant factories and ports. Jefferson Avenue, nearer the water, became a favored address for established families, its long line of residences shaded by mature trees. Gratiot, Michigan, and Grand River Avenues carried traffic steadily toward the interior townships, binding city and countryside together. The streets themselves were paved in wood or stone and illuminated after dark by gas lamps and tall electric towers that cast a faint, steady glow. It was here, amid these ordered streets, that listeners tonight may find a quiet moment of reflection. Some may be resting far from this river and its avenues, while others may be nearer than they realize. Wherever this account reaches, the present place of listening joins silently with the past, as though the distance between then and now had briefly narrowed. The industries of Detroit were already firmly established and widely known. The manufacture of iron stoves dominated, with large foundries producing the ranges that warmed homes across the country. Along the riverfront stood shipyards and dry docks, their slipways busy with repair and construction, while nearby grain elevators rose to receive harvests bound for eastern markets. Tobacco factories operated on a vast scale, their warehouses filled with leaf and finished goods, and seed houses occupied entire blocks, supplying farmers and gardeners far beyond the state's borders. The financial life of the city centered upon Griswold Street, where banking houses stood in close succession, their solid facades reflecting caution rather than speculation. Here the capital of merchants and manufacturers was gathered and redistributed, supporting commerce throughout the lakes region. The Board of Trade oversaw the grain markets, while nearby streets accommodated insurance offices, brokers, and counting rooms. Retail activity extended outward along Woodward and Jefferson, where dry goods houses and jewelers drew steady foot traffic beneath gaslit windows. Beyond the commercial districts, residential avenues unfolded in quieter order. Older French families retained lands once arranged in narrow riverfront farms, now divided into city lots yet still bearing familiar names. German neighborhoods clustered near their churches and social halls, while the Polish community established itself to the north, raising new places of worship that marked their growing presence. Along the river, ferryboats moved steadily between Detroit and the opposite shore, and pleasure seekers crossed to Belle Isle, which offered green refuge from the density of streets. Beyond the paved streets and crowded wharves of the county seat, the survey turned northward into a quieter country. Here lay the tier of townships that formed a gradual passage from city margin to open farm, a landscape neither wholly suburban nor fully pioneer, but resting somewhere between the two. In this region, the older habits of the French settler lingered beside the measured industry of families who had arrived from New York and New England, each shaping the land in their own way. Grosse Pointe occupied the northeastern corner of the county, resting along the calm shore of Lake St. Clair. It was a district long valued for both beauty and history. Along the water stood summer cottages maintained by prominent citizens of Detroit, while inland stretched the ancient ribbon farms, narrow parcels fronting the lake and extending far back into the woods. These lands preserved the names of early families, passed quietly from generation to generation, and supported churches and academies that served as the social anchors of the community. The soil here was deep and dark, yielding fruit and berries that found ready passage to city markets. Westward lay Hamtramck Township, already feeling the outward pressure of the city's growth. Its southern reaches were marked by brickyards and extensive market gardens, supplying both building material and produce to nearby neighborhoods. Farther north, the land remained rural, crossed by well-traveled roads and bordered by creeks that drained steadily toward the river. Railroad lines passed through the township, encouraging small workshops and clustered settlements. Cemeteries occupied shaded tracts of ground, their quiet lanes becoming places of reflection where many of the county's early settlers were laid to rest. Greenfield Township lay directly north of the city limits, its identity shaped by agriculture and long-established land grants. Broad roads crossed its fields, carrying wagons between farm and market, while sandy but productive soils supported steady harvests. Prominent farming families maintained large holdings, their homesteads standing as examples of careful stewardship. Inns and roadside landmarks offered rest to travelers moving between settlements, and the drainage of the land followed the gentle courses of creeks flowing toward the Rouge. At this point in the record, it is worth pausing quietly. Some listening may be far removed from these fields and roads, while others may rest closer than they imagine, perhaps upon land once worked by similar hands. Wherever this account is heard, the present moment joins softly with the past, sharing in a geography shaped by memory as much as by soil. Farther west stood Redford Township, its character defined by sandy loam, heavy timber, and the steady movement of the upper River Rouge. Sawmills made use of its current, and small villages formed where roads and water met. The Chicago Road crossed the southern portion, carrying both goods and travelers toward the interior. Livonia Township lay beyond, quieter still, devoted almost entirely to agriculture. Dairy farms and cheese factories marked the landscape, and scattered hamlets served as modest centers of exchange among neighboring farms. In the northwestern corner of the county, the land rose into a different form altogether. Northville and Plymouth Townships possessed rolling ground and gentle hills, reaching the highest elevations in the county. Here the Rouge flowed more swiftly, turning mill wheels and supplying power to workshops along its banks. Northville developed into a manufacturing village known for furniture making and federal fish culture, while Plymouth supported smaller industries tied closely to farming and tools. These upland districts felt removed from the riverfront bustle, their pace governed instead by seasons and water. Descending southward from the sandy ridges of the northern tier, the survey entered the central belt of Wayne County, a region shaped by the slow, winding course of the River Rouge and the historic thoroughfare of the Chicago Road, known in that period as Michigan Avenue. This district comprised the populous townships of Springwells, Dearborn, and Nankin, a landscape of measured transition. Here, heavy clay soils bore both the smoke of brickyards and the orderly furrows of well-tended farms, a patchwork of labor and agriculture stretching from the city limits to the county's western edge. Springwell's Township lay immediately west of the city, along the margin of the Detroit River. Its soil, a deep bed of superior blue clay, had been deposited by glacial lakes and was prized for brickmaking. The skyline was dominated by the chimneys of brickworks, Grussel, Clippert, Launio, Daniels, Haggerty, and Proctor, each casting smoke that mingled with the river mists. Day and night, the fires baked millions of yellow and red bricks, carted into Detroit on heavy wagons. Clay was dug by hand and steam shovel, tempered in horse-driven pug mills, molded into blocks, and stacked in great clamps to harden in the kiln. The air was thick with wood smoke and baked earth, the scent marking a district that literally built the city. The River Rouge widened near the township's mouth into a navigable channel, lined with industries that used its waters for transport. The Detroit Glass Works and Detroit Copper Smelting Works stood in the southern portion, receiving raw materials from distant mines. Thoroughfares including Michigan Avenue, Grand River Avenue, and Dix Road carried the cottages of workmen and the taverns of drovers. Fort Wayne, a star-shaped brick and earth fortification, maintained its watch over the riverbank, a silent sentinel of the border. The families of Springwells, French and German in heritage, held narrow ribbon farms stretching back from the river. Campow, Nodal, Rouleau, Sicot, Livernois, Vister, Markey, Brender, and Kurth, preserving 18th-century land divisions amid 19th-century change. Proceeding west along the planked Chicago Road, the traveler entered Dearborn Township. The Rouge River bisected this fertile valley, winding past the village of Dearborn, a place of quiet dignity and historical significance. The United States Arsenal, 11 brick buildings arranged around a walled square and erected in 1833, remained a landmark of the frontier era, its Georgian lines reflecting a measured government hand. Nearby, St. Joseph's Retreat, an asylum conducted by the Sisters of Charity, occupied extensive grounds and gardens, offering patients solace in the temperate country air. The surrounding countryside was devoted to farming and market gardening. Sandy ridges grew potatoes and vegetables, while clay bottoms yielded wheat and hay. Prominent families included the Fords, William and his son Henry, the Leslies, Ruddimans, Gullys, Pardys, Nolans, Ten Eycks, and Laphams. At the junction of the lower Rouge, willows trailed their branches in the slow current, where drovers moved cattle along the Chicago Road and farmers carried grain to the city mills. Root crops, notably rutabagas and turnips, were produced in abundance, destined for markets near and far. Beyond Dearborn, Nankin Township stretched westward, populous and well-established. Level lands interspersed with sandy ridges were heavily timbered in places. The River Rouge supplied water for livestock and powered the township's sawmills. The village of Wayne, at the intersection of the Flint and Pierre Marquette and Michigan Central Railroads, thrived as a market town, its streets lined with maple trees and the homes of retired farmers. Factories and foundries operated within the village, supporting trade for surrounding townships. Schools, including a fine union school, offered education, while commercial life buzzed gently, supplying goods from the east. Nankin also hosted the county house, the Wayne County Poor House and Insane Asylum, a large brick complex with surrounding farmland. The institution remained largely self-sufficient, with its own bakery, laundry, and barns. Pioneer families, Perrin, Cady, Swift, Francisco, Newkirk, and Darby, had cleared timber in the early decades of the century, establishing a framework for future settlements. Streams including the lower Rouge, Tonquish Creek, and Barker Creek wound through fields of corn and oats. During winter months, sawmills converted elm, basswood, and oak logs into lumber for local builders, marking the ongoing rhythm of work and sustenance in the township. Continuing westward to the county limits and turning south, the survey entered the purely agricultural townships of Canton, Van Buren, and Romulus. In 1882, this region was known as the Granary of Wayne, a landscape of broad fields, rail fences, and rural quiet, far removed from the clamor of the riverfront. Here, the rhythm of life followed the seasons: wheat sown in autumn, sheep sheared in spring, and the steady passage of time marked by the work of the land. Canton Township lay in the western central portion of the county, a level plain once cloaked in dense forests of beech and maple. The rich clay loam produced abundant wheat, corn, and clover. Villages were few, limited to crossroads hamlets such as Sheldon's Corners and Canton Center, each composed of a general store, blacksmith shop, and cluster of farmhouses. The population was largely yeoman, descended from New York and New England. Families of note included the Sheldons, Lillys, Joys, Hos, Truesdells, Suggets, and Bartletts, who held substantial tracts of land. Drainage followed the sluggish courses of the lower River Rouge and Fellows Creek. The Canton Commons were renowned for their flocks of sheep and dairy herds, while the local cheese factories processed milk to be shipped to Detroit. Rail fences zigzagged across the plains, though Osage orange hedges were beginning to appear as new boundaries. Southward lay Van Buren Township, a district of varied topography and quiet charm. The Huron River entered from the west, meandering through a deep valley with high banks, offering water power for the mills. Belleville, situated on the south bank, was a modest but bustling village. Flowering mills, sawmills, and cooperages lined the banks of the river, while the mill pond reflected wooded bluffs. Soils varied from sandy loam to heavy clay, producing extensive grain fields and thriving orchards of northern Spy and Baldwin apples. Prominent families included the Supes, Dentons, Robs, Posts, Savages, and Quirks. Denton served as the northern hamlet, a quiet center of community. Bridges crossed the Huron, vital both for commerce and the angler, while the Chicago Road carried drovers and farmers, and the township's root crops, notably rutabagas and turnips, moved steadily toward city markets. To the east lay Romulus Township, a level district of sandy loam, still heavily timbered in parts. Charcoal and lumber production remained important industries. The Flint and Pierre Marquette Railroad traversed the township, supporting the growth of the village of Romulus, formerly Pullen's Corners, which served as a shipping point for both lumber and charcoal. Hardwood forests of oak, elm, and ash were converted into conical mounds, covered with earth, and burned slowly over days to produce charcoal for iron furnaces. Families such as the Pullens, Kingsleys, Birds, Fulfords, Morrises, and Bordines cleared the timber and cultivated the land. Streams, including the headwaters of the Ecorse River and Brownstown Creek, ran sluggishly across the fields. The drained Romulus Marsh revealed black muck soil, favorable for onions and peppermint. At the rail junction in Romulus, farmers brought cordwood to be stacked for locomotives. The landscape formed a checkerboard of cleared farms and ancient stumps, bordered by straight sandy roads and rail fences, with Osage orange hedgerows marking property lines. The winter months brought sawmills to life, converting black ash for barrel hoops and white oak for staves. The quiet progress of the township was measured by the sound of the axe and the whistle of the train, marking the advance of civilization in steady, deliberate rhythm. Turning once more toward the Great River, the survey entered the historic Downriver district, comprising Ecorse, Taylor, and Monguagon townships. This region was defined by its frontage on the Detroit River, its French heritage, and its geological wealth of limestone and salt. Here, the industry of the water met the industry of the earth in quiet, steady rhythm. Ecorse Township lay immediately south of Springwells, a site of ancient settlement and the grand port of the French regime. The river Ecorse flowed centrally, joining the Detroit River at the village of Ecorse. In this era, the riverfront sustained a fishing industry of considerable importance. Whitefish were caught in great sends, stretched between shore and islands. The village of Wyandotte had grown into an industrial city, with the Eureka Iron Works and Wyandotte rolling mills producing rails and plate iron. By night, the glow of the blast furnaces lit the river, a beacon of the industrial age. Families such as the Camphouse, Salliots, Rigopels, Bondys, Goodels, and LeBlancs retained their riverfront ribbon farms, their pear and apple orchards notable for age and productivity. Grandport and the River Rouge settlements were growing, while the ceaseless rumble of rolling mills underscored the everyday life of the township. Inland Taylor Township stretched as a rectangular expanse of sandy ridges and clay flats. In 1882, it remained a quiet farming community, settled largely by German immigrants and English families who had moved inward from the river. Prominent names included the Sextons, Cones, Putnams, Sutliffs, Sells, and Pouparts. Branches of the Ecorse River provided drainage for the wet prairies. Villages were absent save for scattered schoolhouses and the Golden Rule Church. Market gardens and general farms supplied Wyandotte and Detroit. Roads were sandy tracks lined with oaks, carrying farmers to the river towns. Sandy loam yielded potatoes and cabbage, while small woodlots were reserved for fuel, punctuating the otherwise open vistas of level fields. Southward lay Monguagon Township, a land of limestone ledges and river vistas. The village of Trenton, perched upon high riverbanks, served as the commercial hub. Shipbuilding flourished here, the yards of Alvin A. Turner launching schooners and steamers that plied the lakes. The Sibley Quarry, lying between Trenton and Wyandotte, supplied flux for iron furnaces and lime for builders. Patriarchal families, including the Sibleys, Truaxes, Slocums, and Alvords, oversaw this industry, their hammers ringing from dawn to dusk. Stone was loaded onto barges along the river, destined for the ports of the upper and lower lakes. Within Monguagon's jurisdiction lay Grosse Isle, the largest island in the Detroit River, known as the Garden Isle of the county. In 1882, it supported summer residences and cultivated estates. The Canada Southern Railroad spanned the river here, connecting island and mainland and reaching Canada. Families of distinction, Biddle, Gray, Broadhead, Rucker, and Keith, maintained farms of exceptional beauty. Orchards of pear and apple extended to the water's edge, a serene contrast to the industrial smoke of Wyandotte across the channel. Continuing southward along the river road, the survey entered the historic territory of Brownstown Township. This district occupied the southeastern extremity of the county, forming a triangular wedge of land bounded by the deep current of the Detroit River, the broad expanse of Lake Erie, and the winding course of the Huron River. In 1882, the landscape was one of memory and quiet industry, where the sandy shoreline bore traces of the War of 1812, the site of the Battle of Brownstown, and the ancient trails of the Wyandotte warriors. The topography was level, part of the lacustrine plain, rising gently from marshy coasts to the rich clay farmlands of the interior. Horizons stretched wide, where the blue of the water met the blue of the sky, broken only by the sails of lake schooners. The hydrography of Brownstown was defined by the confluence of great waters. The Detroit River widened into Lake Erie, creating the marsh and sandy coast known as Point Muilly. This vast wetland formed a labyrinth of sedge, cattail, and wild rice, a haven for canvasback ducks and muskrats. The Huron River traced the southern boundary, a stream of breadth and power, separating Wayne from Monroe County. Interior drainage was provided by Brownstown Creek, Silver Creek, and Reams Creek, sluggish streams winding through timbered lands, their waters darkened by oak tannins. Fisheries along the coast were extensive, with gill nets and pound nets capturing whitefish, sturgeon, and pickerel. The fishery rights along the shore were valuable, held by families who had worked these waters for generations. The settlements of Brownstown were maritime in character and steeped in history. The village of Gibraltar, situated at the mouth of the Detroit River, was a place of quiet dignity and fading industry. In earlier decades, it had been a shipbuilding center, launching great steamers upon the lakes. By 1882, the yards were quieter, yet the village remained picturesque, inhabited by fishermen and sailors, its frame houses weathered by the lake breeze. Families such as the Halls, Lynns, Vreelands, Valades, Stoddards, and Browns preserved its history. To the west lay the village of Rockwood, a shipping point for wood, staves, and farm produce, serving basket makers and rivermen. Stave mills converted white oak into barrels for flour, while the Canada Southern Railroad spanned the river nearby on an iron trestle, linking nations. Inland, flat rock lay upon the Huron River at the township's western edge. Here, the river flowed over smooth limestone, forming a natural ford and providing water power. In 1882, Flat Rock was a thriving market town for southern farmers. Flowering mills, sawmills, and stave factories lined the banks, powered by the current. Prominent families included the Metlers, Garbuts, Moreys, Vreelands, Peters, and Waggers. The dam created a millpond reflecting the oaks along the banks. Village streets were lined with general stores where farmers traded butter, eggs, and garden produce for the manufactured goods of the city. Agriculture in Brownstown was varied and productive. The heavy clay of the Territorial Road district yielded large crops of wheat and clover seed, while the sandy loam of the Sandhill region nurtured melons and garden produce. Families with deep pioneer roots included the Garretsons, Millers, Barrows, Quicks, Parsons, Joyces, and Camphouse. The charcoal industry supplemented the economy, consuming cordwood from remaining forests. Autumn brought smoke from the charcoal pits, a scent marking the season. Horses were bred for draft work, strong animals suited to the clay soils and city drayage, an integral part of local life. Turning westward, the survey followed the winding course of the river into Huron Township. This district lay in the south-central portion of the county, a region defined by the serpentine path of the Huron River. In 1882, the landscape was one of pastoral beauty and agricultural wealth, the river valley forming a ribbon of fertility through timbered plains. The topography was generally level, save for the deep banks of the river, which wound in tortuous fashion through the center of the township, creating oxbows and bottomlands of deep alluvial soil. The Huron River dominated the district, a clear, steady stream providing drainage and power. Tributaries entering the river included Silver Creek and Smith's Creek, draining the flat woodlands to the north. Soils varied from sandy loam on the ridges to heavy clay in the flats, well adapted to general farming. Timber resources remained extensive, with stands of black ash, soft maple, and elm supplying material for charcoal kilns and lumber yards. The Huron Commons were broad grazing lands, where cattle of the settlers roamed freely, fattening on native grasses. Timber extraction was a primary winter occupation. Sleds bore the felled trees to the riverbanks, ready to be floated downstream in the spring thaw. The principal commercial center was the village of New Boston, historically known as Catville. Nestled in a deep bend of the river within the timber district, New Boston bustled with industry. A hotel, flour mill, and several general stores served the community. Early settler families, including the Nolans, Rices, Hosmers, Evans, and Hamiltons, had established sawmills and grist mills, forming the nucleus of the village. In 1882, charcoal kilns consumed the slash from surrounding forests, shipping the fuel to the iron furnaces of Detroit via the Flint and Pierre Marquette Railroad. The depot was a hub of activity, cords of wood stacked high awaiting shipment to the blast furnaces. To the south lay the hamlet of Willow, a station on the railroad situated in a fertile farming district. It served as a shipping point for agricultural produce from the southern sections. The Walt settlement, located in the southwestern corner, was a distinct German community of industrious farmers. Families such as the Waltzes, Krusses, Merrimans, Sturms, Fays, and Felts had cleared the land and constructed substantial frame barns. The German Lutheran church at Waltz stood as a spiritual landmark, its bell tolling across the stump-dotted fields. Industry was divided between agriculture and the manufacture of staves and barrel heading, utilizing abundant white oak. The stave mills employed numerous hands during winter, cutting timber into strips for the cooperage trade of Detroit and Toledo. Agriculture in Huron Township was transitioning from pioneer cultivation to settled husbandry. Orchards planted by early settlers were coming into full bearing, with apples becoming a specialty. The Huron River apple was prized for its keeping qualities. Roads were primitive, often impassable during spring thaw, yet the river served as a highway for logs and produce. Ice harvesting was seasonal, blocks cut from the frozen river stored in sawdust for summer use, supplying local creameries. Bridges at New Boston and Willow were vital links and gathering places, frequented by anglers seeking bass and pike in the river pools. Social life revolved around the river and the railroad. Harvest festivals held in groves along the Huron were events of local significance. Methodist and Baptist churches provided moral instruction, while district schools at section corners educated the youth of families such as the Nolans, Riopels, and Roans. Bridges served as meeting points where neighbors exchanged news while watering horses. The river also provided summer recreation, with picnics held in groves of walnut and hickory lining the banks. Finally, the survey reached the extreme southwestern corner of the county, the township of Sumter. In 1882, this was the most heavily timbered and least developed portion of Wayne County, a region of sand ridges, huckleberry marshes, and dense forests. It was the frontier of the county, where the wolf had only recently disappeared, and the log cabin remained the common dwelling of the settler. The isolation of Sumter defined its character, a place where the traditions of the pioneer lingered longer than in the cleared lands to the east. The topography of Sumter was flat and generally low, traversed by subtle sandy ridges marking the ancient beaches of the glacial lakes. Drainage was affected by the headwaters of Swan Creek and Disbrowse Ditch, which flowed southward into Monroe County. The soil was a light, sandy loam, easily worked and warm, ideal for berries and potatoes. The West Sumter region was famed for its wild huckleberries, which grew in profusion in the wet lands. In season, families from miles around, from Ypsilanti, Belleville, and Romulus, would gather to harvest the berries, camping in the woods and filling wagons with bushels for the city market. The huckleberry train was a local term for the wagons laden, with crates moving toward the depots. There were no large villages in Sumter, only crossroads settlements that served as local centers. Martinsville, located near the center of the township, contained a post office, blacksmith shop, and general store. It was the gathering place for families such as the Martins, Birds, Randalls, Dickersons, Beaches, and Kuykendalls. West Sumter lay on the county line, a quiet hamlet. The industry of the township consisted almost exclusively of charcoal production and timber harvesting. The Sumter kilns were noted for their quality, the smoke of burning pits drifting over the trees in autumn, a sign of the transformation of forest into fuel. Timber was the lifeblood of the township. The sawmills of Sumter whined from dawn to dusk, cutting oak, ash, and basswood into lumber, staves, and hoops. Shingle weavers split straight-grained pine and cedar into roofing shakes, while basket makers utilized black ash of the swamps to craft containers for farmers across the county. Pioneer names Elwell, Kane, Beebe, Northrup, Allard, and Vining were recorded in the annals of the township. These men and women lived self-reliant lives, often miles from the nearest neighbor, hewing a living from the forest and contending with the constant challenge of water and woods to clear their acres. Agriculture in Sumter was varied. While the sandy soil was unsuitable for heavy wheat, it produced excellent crops of buckwheat, rye, and Indian corn. Honey production was another specialty, bees finding ample nectar in wildflowers of the swamps and blossoms of basswood trees. Numerous apiaries dotted the township, white hives standing in rows upon orchard grass. Roads were often corduroyed through swampy swales, shaded by archways of ancient trees. Sumter remained a township of silence and shadow, where the call of the wild turkey echoed in deep woods and deer drank from solitary creeks. The narrative moved inward, away from river margins and forested edges, into the measured interior of the county, where the central townships lay arranged by survey and habit. These districts formed the working heart of Wayne County, neither wholly rural nor fully urban, shaped by repetition, proximity, and labor carried out at a deliberate pace. The townships of Greenfield, Redford, Livonia, the settled interiors of Dearborn, and the inland portions of Springwells composed this central belt. In this era, their lands were laid out in broad fields divided by section roads, with farmhouses set back among orchards and windbreaks. The soil here was productive, a loam well suited to grain, hay, and pasture, sustaining families whose names appeared consistently across tax rolls and church registers. Water defined these townships as surely as roads. The upper Rouge River, middle Rouge, and lower Rouge wound through the region, joined by smaller streams including Tonquish Creek, Fellows Creek, Plum Creek, Connors Creek, Campbell's Creek, Babies Creek, and Savoyard Creek. These waters drained fields, powered mills, and marked property lines, their names repeated in deeds, wills, and boundary descriptions. Willows and alders followed the banks, and low wooden bridges carried wagons across slow currents. Agriculture formed the foundation of life in the central townships. Wheat, oats, barley, and corn were planted in rotation, while clover fields supported growing dairy herds. Milk wagons traveled regular routes, delivering cans to creameries and cheese factories that operated seasonally. Butter was churned in quantity, cheese pressed and cured, and surplus eggs gathered for market. Surnames associated with these pursuits included Briggs, Blue, Burt, Prindle, Pierce, Union, Garchow, and Chilson, appearing repeatedly in cooperative records and township accounts. Milling followed closely behind farming. Along the Rouge and its branches stood gristmills and sawmills of modest size but constant use. Mill ponds widened the streams, their still surfaces broken by the turning of water wheels. Farmers waited with wagons as grain was ground or logs sawn, exchanging news beneath open sheds. Millers and millwrights bore familiar names: Beale, Taylor, Hitchcock, Ellsworth, Kinnean, and Norton, their families often residing beside the works they maintained. Brickmaking and lime burning expanded across greenfield and spring wells, where clay deposits lay close to the surface. Brick yards operated through the warmer months, kilns firing steadily, their smoke visible for miles. Bricks were stacked in careful rows and hauled toward Detroit by wagon. Lime kilns supplied mortar for both rural buildings and city construction. The names Grussel, Clippert, Daniels, Haggerty, Proctor, Macmillan, and Lanio were frequently recorded among laborers and operators in these industries. Roads structured daily movement. Michigan Avenue, Grand River Avenue, Plymouth Road, and connecting section roads formed a grid across the townships. At their intersections stood blacksmith shops, taverns, and general stores. Ironwork was indispensable, and the sound of hammer on anvil marked the days. Blacksmiths named Carpenter, Sutliff, Sell, Cone, and Putnam shod horses, repaired wagons, and forged tools essential to farm and trade. Education and worship anchored community life. One-room schoolhouses stood at regular intervals, their registers preserving the surnames of attending families: Anderson, Johnson, Peterson, Larson, Olson, Whitcomb, Farnsworth, Haviland, and Root. Churches of wood and brick served Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, and Catholic congregations. Nearby cemeteries gathered generations together, their stones repeating dates and names long after voices had fallen silent. Smaller industries filled the remaining seasons. Wool carding, barrel heading, stave cutting, and winter logging supplemented farm incomes. Timber from remaining woodlots was sawn into boards or split for fencing. Women's labor, recorded less often, remained constant through dairying, poultry keeping, weaving, and preservation, sustaining households and local markets alike. The central townships were defined not by spectacle, but by continuity. Creeks followed familiar courses, roads met at predictable angles, family names echoed from ledger to ledger. Work began at dawn, paused at noon, and ended with the lowering sun. In this steady interior, Wayne County sustained its balance, binding field, workshop, and water into a single, enduring rhythm. And thus the record of these central townships settled into the ledgers of the county, defined less by singular events than by repetition and endurance. The creeks continued their quiet courses, the roads bore the same wagon ruts season after season, and the family names passed from school register to tax roll, from baptismal record to headstone. Fields were plowed, mills were turned, kilns were fired, and the measured labor of ordinary days sustained the whole. In this interior of Wayne County, life proceeded not in haste, but in sequence, each task following the last, each generation leaving its marks softly upon the land, until time itself moved as steadily and unremarkably as the slow waters of the Rouge.